The offer on the corner was $840,000, and my father slid the developer letter across the Sunday table to my brother. Not to me, even though the catering book that made Petrucci's worth buying had lived in my head for 15 years. Tony read it out loud like he was announcing a moon landing, and my mother put her hand to her chest, and my father looked at the tablecloth, and nobody looked at me, which was normal, because in my family I was furniture that could carry things. I want to tell you about a deli, because everything I am about to say only makes sense if you understand that a deli is two businesses wearing one coat. There is the front, the glass case and the register, and the smell of provolone, the part the neighborhood sees, the part with the name on the door, and there is the back, the part nobody sees, the standing orders and the vendor accounts, and the crew and the catering, the part that actually makes the money. My father built the front, I built the back, and for 15 years everyone in my family, including me, agreed to pretend those were the same thing, because pretending kept the peace, and my family would burn down a house to keep the peace, as long as I was the one holding the hose. Let me show you what it looked like to be the one who fixed things, because in my family fixing was a job with no title and no pay, and I was very good at it, which is the trap. There was the Christmas, the register came up $900 short, and my father went gray in the face, 68 years old, and about to accuse a nephew, and I quietly put $900 of my own into the drawer and told him I had found a math error, because the truth would have blown up a family holiday, and the lie cost me $900, and in my accounting the lie was cheaper. There were 3 separate payrolls, across the lean years, that I covered out of my own savings when the front had a bad month, $10,000 and $12,000 at a time, floated so that Luz and the crew got paid on Friday, and nobody had to know the front was bleeding, and I never told anyone, not my father, not Ben, not the crew, because knowing would have frightened people, and frightening people was the one thing I could not stand. When Tony forgot to renew the food handling permit 2 summers running, it was me who caught it, me who drove to the county office, me who paid the late fee and never mentioned it, so that Tony could go on believing he was the manager of a thing that ran itself, when the thing that ran it was a woman in a van with a binder, plugging holes he did not know existed in a boat he thought he was steering. That was the arrangement. I absorbed, they floated, and the more I absorbed, the more invisible the absorbing became, until my family genuinely believed the piece was free, because they had never once seen the bill, because I had been paying it in the dark for 15 years. My name is Dana, Petrucci before I married, and still on every invoice, because my husband Ben took one look at 15 years of accounts under my maiden name and said, "Keep it, Dana, that name is worth money," and he was right, which is a sentence I will come back to. I am the second child and the only daughter of Sal and Angela Petrucci, and I was raised in the back of that deli in Marlow, New Jersey, a town across the river from Philadelphia that you have never heard of. The kind of town with a Wawa, a ShopRite, a Catholic church named after a saint who was martyred in a way the nuns would not fully explain, and one Italian deli that everyone in 3 zip codes calls just Petrucci's, no first name needed. I started sweeping that floor at 8 years old. I have never really left it. That is the whole problem, and it is also, it turns out, the whole solution. My brother Tony is 3 years older than me, and he is the ideas guy. That is what he calls himself, the ideas guy. And I need to be fair about him, because if I make him a villain in a cape, then I have cheated, and the truth is worse and quieter than a cape. Tony is genuinely likable. He is the one who remembers the regulars' names, who comes around the counter to shake a hand, who takes the photo with the youth soccer team we sponsored, who posts the reels of the mozzarella being pulled with a caption about family and tradition and heart. Customers love Tony. Vendors tolerate Tony. And Tony has never, not once in his life, done the books, made a payroll, renewed a permit, negotiated a price, or answered the phone at 5 in the morning when the walk-in fails and the wedding is at noon. Tony is the face. I am the reason. There is a face to put on a wall. And there was a wall. I should tell you about the wall, because it is going to matter. By the register, in a gold frame my mother bought at the Christmas tree shops, there was an Employee of the Month photo, and it had been the same photo for 11 years, and it was Tony, grinning, holding a hoagie the length of his forearm, and underneath it, a little brass plate that said Anthony Petrucci, manager. There was no month attached. It was just always Tony, forever, employee of every month, manager of a thing he did not manage, and I dusted that frame twice a week for 11 years, and I never once said a word about it, because saying a word about it would have made me the jealous one, the difficult one, the one who could not just be happy for her brother. Regulars used to point at it, the older ones especially, and say to me, "Your brother, he runs a tight ship." And I would smile and say he sure does, and hand them their order that I had made, in a bag I had stocked, at a price I had set, and they would leave happy, and the frame would grin down at the register, and I understood something standing there that took me years to put into words, which is that a story a family tells about itself is stronger than the truth, that 11 years of a photo on a wall becomes a fact more solid than the woman standing under it, and that if you want to be seen, you cannot simply be the truth. You have to interrupt the story, out loud, in a room, and that interrupting the story would cost me everything the story had given me, which was a place, a family, a wall to dust. So I dusted it. For 11 years, I polished the glass over my brother's face and told myself that being the truth was enough, that reality would assert itself eventually, and reality never once asserted itself, because reality does not assert itself. That is the whole lesson. You have to assert it, and I would not learn how until a Thursday in June with a book in my hands. Here is what 15 years of building the back of a deli actually looks like, so that the number my father slid across the table means something to you. When I took over the office at 23, Petrucci's catered for 2 accounts, both weddings, both cash, both a favor. When I turned 38 this past spring, the back of the house I had built was running standing weekly orders for a hospital cafeteria, 2 law firms in Cherry Hill, a car dealership breakfast every Friday, and a school district lunch contract that took me 2 years to win, plus catering for somewhere north of 200 weddings and funerals and christenings a year, plus a wholesale line. Our bread and our long hots and our red sauce sold under our label to 4 restaurants and a Wegmans in the next county that had approached us. Not the other way around. I built all of it. I signed the crew. I knew the accounts by the sound of their voices before they said hello. And every dollar of it ran through a binder I kept in the front seat of the catering van. A fat, cracked 3-ring binder the crew just called the book, which had the accounts and the standing orders and the pricing and the recipes standardized so that any of my people could execute them. And that book had never once, in 15 years, left my hands. I want to give you 2 mornings from those 15 years, because a number is only worth something if you can see what it is built from. There was a Saturday in August when the walk-in cooler failed at 4 in the morning, and I had a wedding for 220 people at noon, and I did not call my father, and I did not call my brother. I called Luz, and I called Marty, who knew a guy with a refrigerated truck, and I drove to 3 different stores buying ice in 50-pound bags with my own card, and we packed the whole cold line into that borrowed truck in a parking lot before dawn, and the bride danced at her wedding and never knew, and the only person who ever heard that story was Ben, in bed that night, when I finally let my hands shake. Tony posted a reel from that wedding, the mozzarella being pulled, a caption about tradition, and it got 4,000 likes, and he was not there at 4 in the morning, and that is not a complaint, it is just the arithmetic of who does the work and who holds the phone. And there was the school district contract, the one that took me 2 years, 40 pages of requirements and a bid process, and 3 tastings, and a board meeting where a woman with a clipboard asked me about allergen protocols for 600 lunches a day, and I answered every question because I had built the systems that could answer them, and we won it. The biggest single account in the history of Petrucci's. And when it came through, my father shook my hand across the counter and said good, and my mother told the neighborhood that the family had landed the schools, the family, as if it had been landed by a house and not by a daughter who did not sleep for 2 years, and I let her say it, because correcting it would have made me the one who needed the credit, and heaven forbid the furniture need anything. I should tell you about the crew, because a crew is not a thing you buy, it is a thing you earn one bad night at a time, and my brother never understood that. He thought the crew came with the building like the ovens did. Luz Herrera walked into the back of Petrucci's 9 years ago, 22 years old, no papers to speak of, and no experience she could prove, and every reason for me to say no, and something in the way she watched my hands while I broke down a case of tomatoes made me say yes instead, and I taught her, and she was better than me inside 2 years, and I made her kitchen lead over men who had been there longer, which caused me grief I absorbed the way I absorbed everything. When her son was in the hospital for a week the winter before last, I ran her station myself and paid her the whole week, and told the front it was a scheduling thing, and I never mentioned it to her, because mentioning it would have made it a debt, and I did not want her loyalty to be a debt. I wanted it to be a choice, and the difference between those two things is the entire difference between what I built and what my brother thought he was inheriting. Every one of the 6 had a version of that story. The line cook whose truck I co-signed, the dishwasher I drove to his citizenship test and waited outside for 4 hours, the prep woman I found a lawyer for. None of it was in any book, not even mine. And all of it was the actual reason that when I walked out that door in June, 6 people picked up their coats and walked out behind me without me having to ask, because I had spent 9 years earning a thing that does not go on a balance sheet and cannot be sold to a pharmacy. My father was 69 that spring, and in February his heart had scared all of us. 1 stent and a lecture from a cardiologist about the sausage he had eaten every morning of his life, and after that something in him got tired in a way that was not only the heart. He wanted out. I understood it. A man builds a thing for 40 years. He is allowed to want to sit on a beach in Wildwood and watch his grandchildren burn in the sun. What I did not understand, what I did not see coming even though I should have seen it coming from a mile off, was the shape of how he planned to get out. The plan, it turned out, had been discussed. That is the thing about my family. The important conversations happened without me, and then I was informed of the conclusion as if I had been in the room, because I was furniture, and you do not consult the table about where to put the table. The plan was this. The developer wanted the corner, the actual building, for the parking, because a pharmacy chain wanted to put up one of those beige boxes on the block, and $840,000 was a number that made my father's tired eyes go wet. And my father was going to sell the building and give the money to Tony, because Tony was the son and the manager and the face, and Tony was going to take that money and open a new Petrucci's, a modern one, a concept, with a location off the highway and a franchise dream and a consultant he had already hired. And I, Dana, was going to keep running the catering, the real business, the back of the house, for the family, at a salary Tony would set, because that was what I did. I ran things, and it only made sense that I keep running things for my brother now that the front was his name in law and not just on a photo. They told me all of this at that Sunday dinner, after the letter, gently, warmly, the way you tell a child that the dog went to live on a farm. My mother said it would be so much simpler this way, all in one name. Tony said he wanted me right there beside him, said it with his hand on his chest, said, "Dana, you are the backbone," said the word backbone like it was a gift and not a description of a thing that gets stepped on. My father said nothing and looked at the tablecloth, and that silence was the loudest voice at the table, because my father knew exactly what he was doing and could not look at me while he did it. I did not say anything either that Sunday. I want to be honest about that, because if I make myself brave from the first minute I have lied to you, and the whole point of what happened is that it works even for a coward, and I was, for about 2 weeks, a coward. I passed the bread, I did the dishes, I drove home in the catering van with the book on the passenger seat like a person riding shotgun, and I did not cry until I was on the bridge. The lights of the city coming up on the left, and even then I told myself it was because I was tired, because catering season is brutal, because the walk-in had been acting up. The bridge is where I did my real thinking for 15 years. That stretch over the Black River with Philadelphia rising gold on the far bank, 20 minutes alone between the deli and my own front door, the only 20 minutes of any day that belonged to no one but me. I had cried on that bridge before, over lost accounts and a miscarriage and my father's first hospital stay, and I had celebrated on it too. The night we won the schools, I had rolled the windows down and yelled into the wind like a lunatic, alone, because there was no one to tell who would have understood that the win was mine. And now I was crying on it again, and the thing I finally let myself feel, halfway across, with the tires singing on the grating, was not anger, it was grief, plain and enormous. Grief for the girl who had swept that floor at 8 years old, believing that if she was good enough, and useful enough, and reliable enough, she would one day be seen, and who had made herself so useful that she had become invisible, because that is the cruel physics of it. The more load you carry, the more you look like the floor, and my family had walked across me for 15 years and genuinely believed they were walking on solid ground. I did not let myself say the true sentence, which was that my family had just sold the front of a building for $840,000 and handed it to the son, and had budgeted me, the daughter who built the actual company, at a salary, as a fixture that came with the deal. For 2 weeks I said nothing, and I did everything. That is the reflex, the fixer reflex, and I want you to see how deep it runs, because it is the whole reason the trap works. I catered a christening that week, and it was flawless. I renewed the dealership breakfast account for another year on a handshake by their service bay. I onboarded a new on-call cook and taught her the long hots. I did all of it while my family finalized the paperwork to make me an employee of a company I had built. And I did it beautifully, because being needed was the only place I had ever felt safe, and if I stopped being needed for even a week, I was afraid there would be nothing of me left. The crew watched me do it, they knew. Luz would catch my eye across the kitchen and say nothing, and the nothing was a question, and the question was, are you really going to let them? And I did not have an answer, so I made the food, because making the food was the one place I never had to have an answer. I need to explain how I built the back, because it is the mechanism of everything that follows, and I am going to explain it exactly once and then let it get out of the way of the people, because a lecture is a place you hide, and I am done hiding in this story. The value of a catering and wholesale business is not the building, and it is not the name on the door. It is the accounts, the relationships, the crew, and the systems, and where all four of those live, and every one of them lived with me. The hospital did not have a contract with Petrucci's the entity. They had a month-to-month arrangement with Dana, renewed on a handshake every year in a hallway by the loading dock, because that is how those things actually work. And the woman who ran that cafeteria, Gloria, had my personal cell number and had never once called the store. The law firms booked me. The bread went where I told the bread to go. The crew, 6 of them full-time and a dozen more on call, had been hired by me, trained by me, covered by me when their kids were sick and their cars died, and they clocked in for Dana, not for a photo in a gold frame. The recipes were standardized in the book, in my handwriting, in my van. None of that was in the building. The developer was buying a shell, and the family was fighting over the shell, and the entire business, the part with the money, was already sitting in the front seat of a Ford Transit van, registered to me, and nobody in my family had ever once thought to ask where it lived, because they thought the business was the deli, and the deli was just the coat. Tony drove a leased Lexus, white, the big one, and he parked it in the striped no parking zone in front of the store every day, because he said as manager he needed to be visible, and he had a personalized plate that said the name of the deli, and I want you to hold that Lexus in your mind, because it is going to come back, the way these things always come back. He had hired a franchise consultant named Brent for a fee I later learned was $15,000, and Brent had a slide deck, and the slide deck had a word on it in a font that cost money, and the word was scalable. Tony said scalable a lot that spring. He said the old model was tired. He said we, and he meant himself, needed to think bigger than one corner in Marlow. I sat through one of Brent presentations, in the back room after close, because Tony asked me to, and because I still, even then, showed up when asked, and I watched a man in a blazer, with no tie, explain to my family how to build the exact thing I had already built, using words none of them understood, and I understood too well, talking about central production and standing accounts and wholesale channels as if they were a future to be purchased rather than a present. I was running out of a van, and I said nothing. I let Brent sell my 15 years back to my family as his own idea for $15,000, and my mother nodded at the slides and said this, Brent really knows his business, and I looked at my hands. He did not know, because he had never done the work, that the bigger thing already existed, that I had already scaled it, quietly, over 15 years, into the second biggest catering operation in the county, and that it had my name on it and not his, and not, it turned out, my father's. There was a night, about 10 days after that Sunday, when I nearly did the easy thing, and you deserve to see it, because it is the truest night in the whole story. I sat at my own kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote out, in the careful, even hand I use for accounts, the terms I would accept, a salary I could live with, a title, catering director, something with a word in it, a promise, in writing, that Tony would not touch my accounts or my crew. I was negotiating my own captivity, and I was doing a good job of it, because I am good at making a bad arrangement run smoothly. That is my whole gift and my whole curse. I had a number circled. I was going to bring it to Tony and make it work. Make the family work, keep the peace, hold the hose, because the alternative was a hard silence at a Sunday table and the sight of my mother's frightened face, and I would have paid almost anything to avoid that silence, had been paying to avoid it my entire life. Ben found me at the table. My husband is not a man who tells me what to do. He drives the delivery runs with me on the big days, and he keeps his opinions in his pocket, where I can see the outline of them but not the shape. He read the legal pad over my shoulder, the salary, the title, the careful terms of my own surrender, and he did not tell me not to. He just asked me one thing. He said, Dana, who taught the crew to make your father bread? And I said I did, and he said, and who does Gloria call when the walk-in dies at the hospital? And I said, me. She calls me. And he said, okay. And then he said, so what exactly are you negotiating for? And he took his water and he went to bed, and he left the question on the table with me, and I sat there a long time. What was I negotiating for? I was negotiating to rent back a business I already owned in every way that mattered except the way my family could see. I want to tell you the truth about why that was so hard, because it would be easy to make it about courage, and it was not about courage. It was about a girl who learned at 8 years old that love in her family was a wage you earned by being useful, and who was terrified, at 38, that if she stopped earning it there would be nothing underneath, no unconditional floor, just a daughter no one had ever loved for anything other than what she carried. Signing Tony terms meant keeping the wage, staying useful, staying loved in the only currency my family had ever paid me in. Walking out meant finding out whether there was anything left of me when I stopped being the one who fixed it, and that question had teeth, and I had spent my whole life not asking it. I sat at that table until 2 in the morning, turning a pen over in my fingers, and what finally moved me was not anger and not pride. It was Lou's face across the kitchen all those days, the question in it, and the 6 people who came to work every morning for a person and not a photo. And I understood that if I signed Tony terms, I was not only selling myself, I was handing him the crew, the people who trusted me, delivered to a man who thought they came with the building, and I could sell my own captivity if I had to, but I could not sell theirs. I tore the page off the pad. I did not throw it out. I still have it, folded in the book, as a reminder of how close I came to signing. Tony threw a party for the new era. Of course he did. He is the face, and a face needs a stage, and he could not just quietly transfer a business, he had to announce it. So he planned an event at the deli on a Thursday evening in June, invitations by text with the new logo Brent had designed, the old Petrucci script replaced by something sleek and lowercase that looked like it sold phones. He invited the neighborhood, the regulars, a photographer, a woman from the local paper, the developer himself, and Brent the consultant in a blazer with no tie. He invited me by group text with a thumbs up emoji, and he asked me, in a follow up text, to make sure the catering was handled for the party, which is the detail I keep coming back to, that my brother asked me to cater the party, where he would announce that he was taking the business from me, and that I said yes, because of course I said yes. I always said yes, and I made the food, my food, and I made it beautiful, because I could not make it any other way. I asked two people to come who were not on Tony's list. I called Marty Kessler, who has delivered our bread for 31 years, since before I could see over the counter, a man of 70-some who calls me kid and has never once called anyone else at Petrucci's anything but a delay in his route. And I told him what was happening, and he was quiet on the phone, and then he said, "Well, that's stupid," in the flat way of a man who has watched a lot of families be stupid, and I asked if he would come by Thursday evening, just to be in the room, and he said he would, and he asked if he should bring anyone, and I said bring Luz. Luz Herrera has run my kitchen for 9 years. She came to me at 22, and I taught her everything, and she surpassed me at half of it, and the crew follows her the way iron follows a magnet, and she had heard the plan the way the crew hears everything, through the walls, and she had been waiting to see what I would do. All of them had been waiting, and I had not been able to look at them for 2 weeks because I did not have an answer to give them. Now I did. Picture the deli that Thursday evening. String lights Tony had hung. The gold employee of the month frame still on the wall by the register with his 11-year-old grin in it. My food on every table. The good arancini, the eggplant my grandmother taught my father who taught me, the little cannoli I piped to order, the developer in a golf shirt, Brent in his blazer telling a small crowd about scalability, the woman from the paper with a notebook, my mother in her good blouse, working the room, telling everyone how proud she was of her son, her Tony, the new owner, and my father in the corner in a chair, tired, watching the tablecloth of the whole evening the way he had watched the actual tablecloth, unable to look at me. And Tony, glowing, in his element, tapping a fork against a glass to get the room quiet so he could give his speech about family and tradition and the exciting new chapter for Petrucci's. He was gracious in the speech. That was always his gift and always his mistake, the graciousness, because it gave him so much further to fall. Before the speech, there had been an hour of Tony working the room, and I had watched it the way you watch weather you are about to drive through. He walked the developer around the store, gesturing at the tin ceiling and the old scale like a man selling his own childhood, and he stood with Brent by the cannoli, explaining the concept to the woman from the paper, the word scalable floating over the arancini, and he posed for a photo under the string lights with his arm around our mother, the new owner, and the proud matriarch, and my father sat in his corner chair and did not get up, and I brought him a plate he did not eat, and he took my wrist for a second when I set it down, just took it, and let it go, and said nothing, and I have thought a great deal since about that second, about whether it was an apology he did not have the words for, or just a tired old man steadying himself on the nearest reliable thing, which is what I had always been to him, the nearest reliable thing. He thanked the neighborhood, he thanked his mother, he got a little choked up about his father, about carrying the torch, and the room went soft and warm, and I felt the old pull, the enormous gravitational pull, to let the softness be, to not spoil the beautiful evening, to be happy for my brother. And then he turned to me, in front of the developer and the paper and the neighborhood and Brent, and he said, "And I especially want to thank my sister Dana, the backbone of this whole operation, who is going to keep doing what she does best, running our incredible catering, for all of us, for years to come." And he raised his glass to me, and the room turned to look at the furniture, and my mother beamed, and somewhere in the back, Luz went very still. I did not raise my voice. I need that on the record, because it is the entire inheritance my father gave me before he knew he was giving it, the thing I watched him do behind the counter for 30 years, hold a room without ever getting loud, and I had it in me too, I just had never used it on my own family. I set down the tray I was holding, because I was still, at my own execution, serving the food. I picked up the book from where it sat on the end of the counter, the fat cracked binder, and I held it, and I said, quietly, into the warm waiting room, that everyone should absolutely raise a glass, because Tony had just bought himself a beautiful building. The room did the thing rooms do, the beat where nobody understands, then the beat where everybody understands the wrong thing. Tony laughed, the confident laugh, and said, "Dana, come on." And I said, "I mean it. Congratulations. The corner is gorgeous, and the pharmacy will pay you well for it." And then, still quiet, still holding the book, I said the sentence I had driven 15 years to earn the right to say. I said, "The catering isn't in the building, Tony." It never was. It's in this book, and this book goes home with me tonight. And so does the crew, and so does every account, because Gloria at the hospital calls me, the firms book me, the bread follows me, and on Monday morning I open my own doors, and the only thing you bought is a room where a deli used to be. You could hear the walk-in humming. That is the thing about the moment a family stops talking over each other, you finally hear the machines. The walk-in compressor. The string lights buzzing. Somewhere a car going by on the wet street outside. And into that quiet, Tony did the thing they always do. He attacked the wrong object. Because the losing ones never turn and see themselves. They turn and look for who to hit. He did not ask to see the book. Not once, that whole evening, did anyone ask to open the book I was holding, the actual company, right there in my hands. Instead, Tony went at the name. He said I was stealing Petrucci's. He said the name was Dad's, was the family's, was his now, and I could not just walk off with it, and I was a traitor. I had always been jealous, always wanted to be the favorite, always resented that he was the one people loved. He was pointing at me, his face gone from warm to that small red thing, and the beautiful, terrible truth was that he was defending the name on the door, the coat, the shell, the one thing I had explicitly just told him he could keep, while the business, the money, the 15 years, sat in a cracked binder in my hands that he would not so much as look at, because he did not know, had never known, that the binder was the thing. My mother tried to close it down. She stepped between us with her hostess smile stretched thin and said, in the bright voice she used for company, that this was not the place, that we would sort out the family business as a family, later, privately. And I looked at her and I said, quietly, "Mom, there is nothing to sort. The accounts are not the store." She said, "Of course they are. They're Petrucci's accounts." And I said, "No, they are Dana accounts. They always were. Ask anyone who ever booked one." And I watched her understand, for one flickering second, before she slammed the door on it, that the thing she had spent her life measuring, the store, the name, the corner, the photo in the frame, was the part with no money in it, and that the part with the money had a first name and it was mine, and she could not hold that. It was too big and too late, so she reached instead for the smaller thing, the appearance, the neighbors, the smoothing, which is what she always reached for, because appearance was a thing she knew how to hold and truth was not. That is when Marty Kessler set down his coffee. He had been standing by the door with Luz, and he did not perform, he just said, in his flat delivery man voice, to the room, that he had run bread to this family for 31 years, and that the account had been in the kid name for 15 of them, and that he delivered where Dana told him to deliver, and that if Dana opened a place on Monday, the bread would be at Dana Place on Monday, and that was not a threat. It was just Tuesday. It was just how the route worked, and anyone who thought a bread man was loyal to a building instead of the person who answered the phone had never run a route in their life. And then Luz, who is not a talker, said one thing. She said, "We all go where Dana goes." She said we, and she meant the crew, the whole back of the house, and she said it looking at Tony, and Tony understood, finally, a fraction of what he had lost, and you could see it hit him, that the people who actually made the food were standing by the door in their coats, not behind the counter in his new logo. The room broke. Not toward me. That is the part people always expect wrong. The developer looked at his phone and remembered somewhere to be. Brent the consultant, whose whole slide deck had just been revealed to be a plan to scale a shell, found the arancini very interesting and studied them intently. The woman from the paper wrote something down, and I have wondered ever since what, and never asked. And my brother, in front of the neighborhood he had invited to watch him be crowned, came apart, not quietly, told me I was dead to him, told me to get out of his store, gesturing at a room full of my food, and I set the last tray down and I did not answer him, because there was nothing to answer, and the not answering was the entire war. And my mother. This is the part I have to tell carefully, because it is the truest part and the cheapest to get wrong. My mother stopped being proud and started being frightened, and the fear was real, and for a second I saw her whole, a woman of 67 who had spent her life certain of a shape her family would hold, who measured her whole worth in what the neighborhood thought of her children, and who was watching, live, in front of the woman from the paper, her son come apart and her daughter walk out, and I felt it. The tide, the overwhelming pull to fix it, to soften it, to give her something. Because she was small and scared, and she was my mother and I had never once in my life been able to bear her fear. I stepped toward her. I was going to say something gentle, and my mother took my arm and her eyes were wet, and she leaned in close so the room would not hear, and she asked me, please, to just smooth it over, to tell everyone it was a misunderstanding, to not embarrass the family in front of all these people, to think about how this would look at church on Sunday. She had not heard a word, or she had heard every word and could not let one of them in, because letting them in would mean the shape was gone, and it was easier to ask me to hold the hose one more time than to feel the house actually burning. That was the canceling line. The fear was real, and the love in me was real, and none of it changed the shape of what she was. A woman who, even now, even in the wreck of it, could look at her daughter and ask her to please make the impossible thing look smooth so that the neighbors would not talk. And I closed my mouth, and I did not smooth it over, and that silence was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than any wedding I ever saved, harder than the bridge with the city lights, harder than 11 years of dusting a frame with my brother face in it. I picked up the book. I picked up one more thing too, from the hook by the office door, a dented aluminum half-sheet pan, the one my father taught me to make his bread on when I was 12, warped from 30 years of the oven, worth nothing, you could not sell it for $1, and it was the only thing besides the book that I took out of that building, and I have it at the new place now, and I make the bread on it, and I will get back to it. Ben was at my side by then. He had come across the room without a word, and he did not speak. He just put his hand flat on my back, warm, steadying, and let it be my hand that carried the book, my feet that walked, my choice, and we went out past the gold frame with Tony grinning in it forever, and out the door Marty had come in, into the June evening, and the string lights buzzed behind us, and that was the last time I stood behind that counter. That was 14 months ago. I am going to tell you how it settled, because you have stood in a lot of hard rooms with me, and you have earned the after, and the after is quieter than the break, which is how you know it is true. I opened on the Monday. That is not brave. That is just how catering works. The hospital did not care about my family drama. They had 400 lunches due Tuesday. So I signed a lease on a commissary kitchen in an industrial strip 2 miles away that I had, if I am honest, been quietly pricing for a year without letting myself know why. And the crew clocked in Monday morning, all 6 of the full-timers and most of the on-call, and Luz had the ovens hot before I got there, and Marty backed his truck to the new dock at 5:30 and called me kid and asked where I wanted the bread. Not one account left. Not one. Gloria at the hospital did not even know there had been a question until I told her. And she laughed and said, "Honey, I don't have a contract with a building, I have a deal with you," which is the whole thesis of my life, said back to me by a woman who runs a cafeteria and understood it better than my own father. The first week was chaos, the good kind, the kind where the problems are yours. We were running 400 hospital lunches out of a kitchen with half its shelving still in boxes, and the school contract kicked back in with the fall term, and a bride called panicking because she had heard Petrucci's closed and thought her September wedding had evaporated, and I told her, "No, honey, the wedding is fine. I am the wedding. I just have a different address now," and I could hear her exhale 2 counties away. Every vendor moved with us inside a month. The dealership never missed a Friday. The law firms did not so much as pause their standing order. It turned out that 15 years of answering the phone at 5 in the morning is a kind of contract that no developer can buy and no brother can inherit, written in nothing but the reliability of a person, and utterly unbreakable precisely because it was never written down. I called the new place Dana's, just Dana's, no last name, because my brother could have the last name was on a building, and a building was for sale. The new Petrucci's never opened. This is the part I take no joy in, or I take a joy in it I am not proud of and try not to feed. Tony took the $840,000, or the piece of it my father gave him, and he and Brent found a location off the highway, and they built out a concept, sleek and lowercase, and they opened without a catering arm, because the catering arm had walked out the door in June. And it turns out a deli concept off a highway with no standing accounts and no wholesale line and no crew that knows the recipes is just a very expensive sandwich shop competing with a Wawa. And Marlowe did not follow him there, because Marlowe followed the food and the food followed me. He was closed within the year. The Lexus went back, quietly, in the night, the way they do, except Marty sees everything on his route, and told me the striped no parking zone in front of the old corner was empty now, just a pharmacy going up, beige, like they always are. He drove a regular car after that, Marty told me, a used sedan, nothing on the plate, and I felt something when I heard it that was not triumph, it was closer to grief, because the Lexus had been the whole tragedy of my brother in one least object. A man who had spent his life buying the appearance of a thing rather than doing the work of it. The plate, the frame, the reel, the blazer consultant, the sleek lowercase logo, all of it the costume of a business instead of the business. And now the costume was gone, and there was just Tony, in a used car, who had never learned the one thing our father could have taught him, and taught me instead, which was that the work is the only thing that is real, and everything else is a coat. The employee of the month frame, Luz told me, ended up in a dumpster behind the old store when the developer cleared it out, glass cracked, Tony grinning up at the sky from the trash, 11 years of being the manager of a thing he did not manage, and I did not go look, but I thought about it, and I found I did not need it in the dumpster to feel anything, because the frame had never been the business, and neither had the man in it, and I had spent 11 years dusting a lie, and I was finally, mercifully, free of the dust. The woman from the paper did write something, it turned out. It ran a few weeks later, a small business piece, and it was not about the fight. She had the grace or the discretion to leave the fight out of it. It was about a new catering kitchen in the industrial strip, and the woman who had run the back of a beloved local deli for 15 years and struck out on her own, and it used a word about me that no one in my family had ever used in print or otherwise. It called me the one who had quietly built the largest independent catering operation in the county, and my mother, Marty told me, bought 5 copies and then never mentioned it to a soul, which is the most my mother way of loving someone I can imagine, buying the evidence of your daughter and hiding it in a drawer next to the shame. The neighborhood, for its part, did the thing neighborhoods do, which is follow the food and pretend they always knew. People who had eaten at Petrucci's their whole lives found the new place inside a month. Not for me, they would have told you, but for the eggplant, and I let them keep that, because the eggplant was the point. The eggplant had always been the point, and if a whole town needed to believe they were loyal to a recipe rather than a person, that was fine. The recipe was mine too. My father came to me in September. He drove himself in his old Buick to the commissary in the industrial strip, and he stood in the doorway in a cardigan, looking small in a way that broke something in me, this man who had held a room without raising his voice, and he watched Luz and the crew move around a kitchen that hummed, my kitchen, and he did not apologize, because he does not have the words, men of his make never got the words, but he stood there a long time, and then he said, "You built all this," and I said, "Yes, Dad," and he said, "I gave it to the wrong one," and I said, "I know," and neither of us could do anything with that, so I did the only thing I know how to do, I put him to work. I want to be honest that I almost did not. I stood in that doorway looking at the man who had slid the letter to Tony, who had looked at the tablecloth instead of at me, who had spent my whole childhood teaching me to hold a room, and my whole adulthood watching me hold his and calling it good. And part of me wanted to let him keep standing in the doorway, small, forever, the way he had let me be furniture. And then I thought about the bread. I thought about being 12 years old and his big hands over my small ones, showing me the fold, the patience of it, the one thing he had ever given me that no one could sell, and I understood that the bread was not a debt he owed me. It was a thing he had given freely before he knew how to take everything else, and I could hold both, the gift and the betrayal, in the same two hands, the way you hold dough. So I let him make the bread. I let him make the bread. On the dented half-sheet pan, the one I took, I let my father make his own bread in my kitchen, and he cried a little into the dough, where he thought I could not see, and now he comes in 3 mornings a week, and makes the bread, and calls himself, when the crew asks, the bread guy, and it is a restoration, and it is on probation, and I do not know if it holds. Some mornings he is the father who taught me, and some mornings he is the man who slid the letter to Tony, and I have stopped needing to know which one will walk in. I have just set a place for him and left the ending open, because that is the most I have and the most he deserves, and I have decided it can be enough. My mother has not come. She sends things through my father, a comment, a message, never directly, and the night of the party she left me a voicemail, a long one. I could see it was almost 4 minutes on the screen, and I have never played it. I want to be careful about how I say that, because it is the thing I understand least about myself. I saved it. It is still there, 14 months later, 4 minutes of my mother voice from the night the house burned, and I have not listened to a second of it. And some nights I hold the phone with my thumb over it and I do not press. And I have started to think that not knowing what my mother needed to say to me that night is a kind of mercy. Hers or mine I cannot tell, and that as long as I do not play it, it can be an apology, and the second I play it, it will probably be one more request to smooth things over, and I am not ready to trade the apology it might be for the ask it probably is. The dented half-sheet pan is on the rack by the ovens at Dana's. It is warped and pitted and black at the edges and worth nothing. You could not sell it for $1, and it is the pan my father taught me to make his bread on when I was 12 years old. And every morning Luz or my father or I pull the bread off it, the same bread, my grandmother recipe standardized in a cracked binder that never once left my hands. And I look at that ugly pan and I think about the 2 businesses wearing one coat, and how my whole family fought for the coat and let the body walk out the door, and how the thing I most needed to know I could not have learned any other way, which is that you do not have to raise your voice, you do not have to win the name, you do not have to be believed by the people who need you to be furniture. You only have to know where the business actually lives. And I always knew where it lived. It lived in a book in the front seat of a van, and it lived in a crew that came for a person and not a photo, and it lived in the hands of a woman who had been building it quietly for 15 years, while everyone she loved looked right past her at a corner they thought was worth $840,000. They sold the coat, I kept the body, and it turned out the body was the whole thing, and had been the whole time, and all I ever had to do was pick up my book and walk. And people ask me sometimes, customers who heard some version of the story, whether I miss the old place, the corner, the tin ceiling, the name over the door, and I tell them the truth, which is no, I do not miss a building, you cannot miss a coat once you understand it was never keeping you warm. What I missed, for a while, was the old story where I was the good daughter holding the family together, because that story was the only home I had ever been given, and I had loved it, even though it was slowly erasing me, the way you can love a house that is making you sick. It took me most of a year to stop reaching for it. And then one morning, I was standing in my own kitchen before dawn, with the ovens ticking as they warmed, and Luz coming through the door with her coat still on, and my father tying an apron by the bread rack, an old man about to make bread on a dented pan in his daughter kitchen, and I understood that I had a new story now, one I had written myself, in a book that never left my hands, and it was smaller and truer, and it had my name on the door, just my name, Dana, and no one could sell it, because it was not a building, it was a woman who finally knew where the business had always lived.